It doesn't take a declaration to recognize when the world is shifting. Sometimes it's enough to see who's standing together. In the past months, Putin has shaken hands with Xi Jinping under red banners in Beijing. Kim Jong-un has walked beside Russian generals as long-range missiles rolled through Pyongyang. Iranian drones, Chinese radars, and Russian warships are now training in the same seas. None of this is a coincidence. It's the outline of a new order, one built not through treaties, but through intent. A silent alliance taking shape under the surface, bound by a single idea: to end Western dominance. And if it ever becomes official, the balance of the world as we know it will collapse overnight. Because what's forming now isn't just a military bloc. It's the beginning of an anti-NATO world, and it's already happening. For the past 2 years, global tension has stopped being a collection of isolated crises and turned into something deeper, a structural shift in the balance of power. The world that was once held together by Western leadership is starting to fracture. NATO, for decades the symbol of collective security, now stands as the last pillar of an old order. But beneath it, a new axis is forming, one built on sovereignty, control, and resistance to Western influence. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, each driven by its own agenda, yet all converging on the same idea, that the world no longer needs the West to define stability. In this video, we'll look at how this anti-NATO alliance could take shape, what forces are driving it, and most importantly, what it would mean for the United States and the rest of the world if it became real. Because every system of power has a breaking point, and this may be ours. Every alliance begins long before it has a name. It starts as a pattern, a convergence of interests, a silent alignment of purpose. That's what we're seeing now. Long before anyone dares to call it an anti-NATO alliance, the foundations are already being laid. What began as a series of crises in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in the Pacific, is evolving into a shared perception that the Western order has lost its legitimacy, its balance, and its respect. For Russia, the seed was planted the moment it realized that no Western capital would ever again treat Moscow as an equal partner. For China, it grew through years of containment, trade wars, and diplomatic isolation under the banner of strategic competition. For Iran, it sprouted from decades of sanctions that turned self-sufficiency into ideology. And for North Korea, it has always been survival, the need to remain visible, no matter the cost. None of these regimes trusts the other. They have fought, spied on, and betrayed one another for years. But in today's fractured world, trust is no longer the currency of power. Leverage is. What unites them isn't friendship or ideology, but the belief that together they can dilute the influence of the United States without confronting it directly. Through weapons trade, energy deals, cyber coordination, and shared disinformation networks, they are building a web, not a pact, but a pressure system designed to strain the West where it's weakest. And the irony is that this cooperation doesn't need a formal name to exist. It's already visible in the trade corridors between Moscow and Beijing, in the drone shipments from Tehran to Russia, in the satellite data shared quietly between Pyongyang and Chinese labs. The alliance, in essence, is already alive. What it lacks in formality, it makes up for in intent. And intent is how every new order begins. The idea is no longer abstract. What started as scattered gestures of defiance is turning into a coordinated rhythm, a structure taking shape beneath the surface. The anti-NATO alliance wouldn't be born with a declaration or a flag. It would grow in the shadows, built piece by nations that claim to stand alone, yet move as if guided by the same hand. It begins with weapons, not through a formal pact, but through repetition. One delivery, then another, until cooperation becomes habit. Drones from Iran, engines from Russia, chips from China, different industries feeding the same battlefield until logistics replace loyalty. From there, the alliance extends into energy. Russian oil redirected eastward, Iranian gas sold through Chinese banks, North Korean coal traded under new names. The supply chains that once depended on the West slowly learn to live without it. And once that dependency breaks, it never fully returns. But the most powerful links are not the ones made of steel or fuel, they are the diplomatic reflexes. When one speaks, the others echo. When one is sanctioned, the others adjust. When one is accused, the others deny in chorus. A language of alignment begins to form, subtle but unmistakable. In press statements, at the UN, in the tone of every televised speech. It's not a military alliance. It's a synchronization of narratives. And as these rhythms converge, trade, weapons, diplomacy, technology, the need for a treaty disappears. Function replaces form. The alliance doesn't need to exist on paper because it already operates in practice. Its real strength lies in ambiguity. Each member can claim independence while acting as part of a larger design. By the time the West calls it what it is, it will be too late. Because an alliance that doesn't exist officially can't be contained officially. It doesn't need to declare war to shift the balance, it just needs to stop pretending that the old order still holds. What begins as cooperation soon becomes architecture. Once an anti-NATO alliance functions, even unofficially, the world no longer revolves around a single center of gravity. Washington stops being the referee and becomes one player among many. Every sanction, every naval deployment, every diplomatic warning would echo against a coordinated wall of resistance. The United States has always relied on a simple equation, that its actions would trigger hesitation, not unity. That equation would break. Because now, when America acts against one, it risks awakening all. The meaning of deterrence itself would shift. During the Cold War, deterrence rested on two superpowers who shared a basic rule: mutual survival. In this new structure, that rule dissolves. The calculus isn't about destruction anymore, it's about distraction. Russia pulls attention in Europe, China in the Pacific, Iran in the Middle East, each crisis feeding the other, stretching Western capacity to the point where control becomes reaction. Power would no longer be about striking first or holding territory. It would be about forcing your opponent to defend everywhere at once. For the United States, that's a nightmare of logistics and psychology. The Pentagon has the hardware to fight in 3 theaters, but not the focus, not the political will, not the public tolerance for endless confrontation. The anti-NATO alliance wouldn't need to win outright, it would only need to exhaust, to make democracy feel inefficient, diplomacy irrelevant, and leadership fragmented. And when perception changes, so does power. For the NATO allies, the balance would become even more fragile. Europe, bound to the US by defense and to Asia by trade, would find itself trapped between dependencies. A crisis in the South China Sea could stall German industry. An oil shock from Iran could paralyze Eastern Europe. The old promise of collective defense would morph into collective vulnerability. In essence, the anti-NATO alliance wouldn't need to fire a missile to reshape the world. It would only need to prove that the West no longer decides the rules alone. From that moment, the world wouldn't just be multipolar, it would be post-American. When a new center of gravity forms, the world doesn't split overnight, it tilts. Every region, every market, every alliance begins to feel the pull. An Eastern alliance wouldn't simply redraw borders, it would rewrite how power moves. Europe would become the hinge of global tension, caught between dependence on American security and reliance on Eastern resources. Its geography, once an advantage, would turn into exposure. Every shipment of gas, every digital network, every vote at the UN would carry the weight of a divided loyalty. The Middle East, long treated as a chessboard, would again become a player. Iran's survival would no longer rely on evading sanctions, but on belonging to a bloc that turns isolation into leverage. Saudi Arabia, sensing the shift, would hesitate, still bound to the dollar, but drawn by the gravity of a market that promises autonomy from the West. The region's future would no longer depend on who controls oil, but on who defines its price and under which currency. Asia would stretch in 2 directions at once. Japan and South Korea anchored to Washington, China, and its partners, weaving a web of influence through trade, ports, and digital infrastructure. Southeast Asia would become the prize, not for its armies, but for its algorithms. Whoever builds its data routes controls the information arteries of the next century. And then there's Africa, the silent frontier. While the West debates principles, Beijing and Moscow build roads, railways, and defense agreements. In the struggle for influence, presence beats promise. What once was a developing continent would turn into the decisive tiebreaker, the supplier of rare minerals, the home of military bases, the demographic engine of the future. Even the smallest flashpoint, Taiwan, Syria, the Red Sea, Ukraine, would no longer be local. Each would act like a fault line, sending tremors through currencies, supply chains, and public opinion. A drone strike in the Gulf could raise prices in New York. A cyber attack in Asia could darken screens in Europe. The boundaries between regional and global would collapse, leaving behind a single crowded chessboard and far too many players who believe they're winning. In that world, crisis stops being an exception. It becomes the system itself. For the United States, the impact wouldn't just be geopolitical, it would be existential. Power has always been part of the American identity. Since the end of World War II, leadership of the free world wasn't a slogan, it was the country's sense of purpose. But if an anti-NATO alliance takes shape, that narrative begins to fracture. Washington would still be powerful, but not central. The difference seems semantic, yet it's everything. A superpower without the world's unquestioned attention is just another nation with interests to defend. Politically, it would mark the end of a moral monopoly. The idea that America defines what democracy means, who deserves sanctions, and which wars are just, would face a mirror, one reflecting a rival system with its own logic of legitimacy. In such a world, every American statement abroad would meet a counter-statement, every alliance a counter-offer. The authority of the United States would start to operate in negotiation, not dominance. Economically, the consequences would be even deeper. The dollar, long treated as the bloodstream of global trade, would face competition from new payment systems and energy deals settled in yuan or rubles. The shift wouldn't collapse the dollar overnight, but it would erode something subtler, the habit of global dependence. If nations no longer need the US currency to trade, they also need less of its permission. Influence would fade, not by rebellion, but by replacement. Strategically, the challenge would be one of endurance. The Pentagon's network spans the world, hundreds of bases, fleets, and commitments that cost more each year to sustain. Against a coordinated rival bloc, the US would be forced to defend multiple fronts without the luxury of surprise or psychological superiority. Every deployment would feel heavier, every intervention riskier. The question would no longer be, can America act, but can it still afford to act everywhere at once? Yet the deepest shock would be psychological. For generations, Americans have lived with the quiet assumption that their country was the stabilizing force of the planet, the reason chaos stayed over there. But when an alternative system rises, that distance collapses. The free world stops being a fact and becomes a belief, one that not everyone shares anymore. And once belief cracks, so does the sense of safety that depends on it. For the average American, the shift wouldn't look like invasion or defeat. It would feel like noise, headlines about new currencies, higher energy prices, trade wars, digital blackouts. But beneath it all, the real transformation would be internal, a gradual realization that the US no longer sets the rhythm of the world. And when power stops being invisible, people start to feel its absence. Because when dominance turns into participation, the myth of control fades, and what replaces it is something the country hasn't felt in decades: uncertainty. When America's certainty fades, the rest of the world doesn't stand still, it recalculates. The rise of an anti-NATO alliance would force every nation, willingly or not, to decide where to belong. The question would no longer be democracy or authoritarianism. It would be stability or dependence. In a fractured order, neutrality stops being virtue, it becomes risk. Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Turkey, the so-called middle powers, would suddenly find themselves pulled from both sides. Their economies are tied to the West, their resources and geography to the East. Each would try to play both fields, but in a polarized system, balance turns quickly into exposure. The very attempt to remain neutral would make them battlegrounds of influence through trade, infrastructure, and technology. Trade routes would realign first. The oceans, once symbols of open commerce, would split into corridors of control. The South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Arctic, each would become a gate, monitored by one bloc or the other. Access would depend on allegiance. Technology would follow. Networks, satellites, digital platforms, everything built to connect would start to divide. The world's internet would no longer be global. Two ecosystems would emerge, one led by Western corporations, governed by regulation and transparency, the other by state systems built on control and surveillance. Every country would have to choose which web to plug into, and that choice would define its politics more than any election. Energy would complete the split. Pipelines, nuclear partnerships, and rare earth trade would no longer be neutral exchanges, but instruments of loyalty. Nations that once sold to everyone would be forced to prioritize alliances. A power outage, a drought, a fuel shortage, these would no longer be local crises, but signs of alignment or punishment. And yet, unlike the Cold War, this division wouldn't come with walls or declarations. It would unfold silently, inside markets, codes, and supply chains. Two worlds living on the same planet, one fluent in freedom, the other fluent in control. The line between them wouldn't be visible on a map. It would run through every port, every company, every decision made in the name of survival. In this system, even staying still becomes a political act. And for many nations, the choice won't be which side to join, but which side they can afford to anger. Because the new world map won't be drawn by borders, it will be drawn by dependencies. Linking from the new map of dependencies, here is the truth that matters most. The Anti-NATO Alliance is not an idea in the air, it is a concrete path, and like every path, it becomes dangerous when it starts to feel inevitable. History never repeats, but it often rhymes. Two blocks, two visions, one prize, the power to write the rules. The real question is not whether this alliance will be born, it is whether anyone can interrupt the convergence before it hardens into structure. The first casualty of a world split in two is not territory, it is optionality. The second is time, because when systems polarize, decisions speed up, misreads multiply, and leaders respond to pressure rather than to purpose. Wars rarely start with a missile. They start with schedules, with sanctions, with narratives that leave no exits. The only antidote is clarity, channels that stay open when everything else closes, guardrails that are paid for in advance, a willingness to absorb cost today to prevent a drift that becomes fate tomorrow. For citizens, that means lucidity, not panic. For leaders, it means restraint that does not look like weakness. For alliances, it means flexibility without fear. Because when the world divides, strength belongs to those who keep thinking while the machinery around them tries to think for them. In the end, it will not be the largest arsenal that decides the next era. It will be the side that refuses to lose its cool head. If you want to understand the world not through headlines but through logic, before the noise turns into panic, subscribe to SafetyZone. Here, we don't chase fear, we break it down. Because the more you understand, the less you're controlled.